It sounds like the Russian MOD and the Wagner chief have very different accounts of what's happening to the Russian forces in Bakhmut. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and we are going to be taking a look at reports from the front lines on just what is happening and how little we really know. Let's get into it.
A Ukrainian tank rumbled toward Bakhmut on Friday as Kyiv claimed its forces had advanced more than a mile around the shattered ruins of the eastern city. Russian forces...
So this is actually completely correct. We'll take a look real quick here. Let's get this up. When we take a look at the map, which if you've been part of my daily updates, none of this is going to be news to you. But as you can see, the areas in blue are considered like permanently liberated, or at least fully Ukrainian control. But here is 5 days ago. You can see Russian forces making significant advances. Here is actually a week ago, right? The 7th. So you could see, we see Russian forces being pushed back here in the southern part near Klachivka. And then suddenly, between the 10th and 11th, you see significant between the 7th and the 10th, you see some significant gains. And then you see over the next 4 days, some really substantial pushback of Russian lines, all in the north and south of Bakhmut. And I think this is crucial to acknowledge that Ukrainian forces not choosing to fight in the city itself, where their advantage in tanks and aircraft and indirect fire, or rather their advantage is primarily in tanks and mechanized assets, where that advantage is going to be more easily mitigated. Instead, they're trying to push back and surround Russian forces in Bakhmut, forcing them to withdraw. So that seems to be the general strategy.
Have fought for months to seize Bakhmut without success. The Russian Defense Ministry on Friday said that Ukraine had deployed more than 1,000 troops and up to 40 tanks in more than 24 attempted attacks in the direction of the town of Soledar.
Men's wedding bands are boring. There, I said it. Women often get to choose unique and original bands that reflect their personality, their history, their preferences. But for most of history, men's wedding bands have been interchangeable. But today's sponsor, Gentle Bands, is looking to reimagine men's wedding bands. They want to bring craftsmanship and attention to detail to wedding bands. I need a everyday band, since as you guys know, gold is soft and malleable. So for everyday wear, I needed a more durable ring. So I went with the Symphony. It's made of tungsten, one of the hardest and most durable metals, with embedded dinosaur bone and meteorite fragments. It speaks to me because as a boy, I would hunt for fossils in the dry creek bed at my grandfather's farm. Gentle Bands has a ton of options, with all different kinds of metals and finishes, and a wide variety of personal touches you can add. From whiskey barrel wood to guitar strings, you can get the band that speaks to you and your personality. Right now, Gentle Bands even offers free engraving, free returns, and free lifetime replacement. If you use code CombatVet and the link in my description, you can get 25% off your order. So check out Gentle Bands and reimagine what men's wedding bands can be. So I want to point this out. So Soledar, again, as we know, is in the northern part here. And when he talks about 1,000 troops and 40 tanks, this is about half a brigade. I want to point that out. That's who is involved in this action here, according to Russia. Now, obviously, Russian intelligence, not the greatest in the world. So I think it's more likely that you're seeing one brigade. It seems sort of stupid to train a brigade together, right? Brigades train as a single fighting unit, and then it doesn't make any sense to cut them in half. So I think you actually are seeing probably a brigade effort. You're probably seeing what's called a light infantry brigade, or an IBCT in Army doctrine. And the reason I say that is because the actual distance covered in this combat is not substantial enough, right? When a tank breaks through enemy lines, they can cover miles of terrain. In contrast, when light infantry, who are primarily on foot, break enemy lines, they can advance up to several kilometers a day, but usually you're going to see numbers that look like 1 or 2 kilometers in a given day. And that's what we're seeing here, right? We're seeing these sort of systematic advances, but again, we're talking about 1 or 2 kilometers a day. That's what you'd expect from light infantry forces. So I think that's the BCT that's involved in this, or the brigade that's involved in this. And I think you're going to see them try to complete this Bakhmut encirclement, force a withdrawal. But most importantly, what they're doing is pinning the Russian forces in place, right? Russian forces can't really, what they can't do is break contact and reinforce another sector. So what I suspect is that at some point, Russian forces are going to have to commit their reserves, right? Troops held in the rear to shore up any crisis on the front, to reinforce an issue on the front. They're going to have to commit that reserve force to the defense of Bakhmut. Once they do, that reserve force will no longer be available to bolster Russian defensive efforts elsewhere. And that's where I think you'll see some of these more mechanized brigades really come into the fight. That's my thesis anyway.
The military admitted it was regrouping its forces, suggesting its fighters had fallen back. The leader of a Russian mercenary force gave a different assessment. Evgeny
Now, I want to point something out, right? Prigozhin is a billionaire, and he is filming these videos with lower quality footage than even I'm recording, and I'm some guy. The reason, it's not an accident, right? Look at the difference. Here is the Russian spokesman for the Ministry of Defense. You can see he is very well lit. He appears to be in some sort of command center with a big map and a bunch of screens behind him. He's wearing a relatively dress military uniform. All of this is meant to convey to the Russian public authority, control. It's meant to project a certain image. Now, I want you to look at Prigozhin, who's in a plywood shack of some kind. He's assessing the situation not with multiple screens, but on an iPad. And listen to the audio quality itself. Right? It sounds like it's being recorded on a phone. It's not an accident, right? You can record with pretty good quality with things you can put in a backpack. The reason he's doing this is he wants to juxtapose himself as a involved commander who knows what's really happening on the ground against this sort of very polished, very military authoritarian figure. So I want you guys to just understand when you see some of these video clips that there is a reason they're released to the public, and they are, in both cases, carefully staged, managed to project a certain image.
Evgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner paramilitary group, said the defense ministry was lying and Russian forces had been routed and forced to flee. Reuters has been unable to verify reports of battlefield movement.
So I want to point out, what's he mean rout versus repositioned or withdrawn? In the military, a rout is a term for when control and order breaks down. Like, there is a way that an army can pull back in the face of an enemy, but it's important that some units will continue to fight a defensive effort while other units pull back to designated positions, and then the units that are in position, right, will then take up the fight as the other unit withdraws. They bound back in a systematic way. It's a plan. It's just like an offensive, right, where you come up with a plan for exactly how your units are going to maneuver. It looks like an offensive in reverse, and it requires some planning, some deliberation. It requires communicating orders, which can be hard because routes don't happen when things, or withdrawals don't happen when things are going great. They're oftentimes in situations where things are tenuous. There's a lot of pressure. So when units begin to withdraw, it risks becoming a rout. A rout is the opposite. A rout is when soldiers become desperate or overwhelmed emotionally or literally overwhelmed by the enemy power facing them, and they, instead of maintaining contact and discipline, they run backwards. And oftentimes it takes a while for commanders to regain control of those units that are being routed. And remember, in the withdrawal scenario, the people they are fighting, in this case the Ukrainian forces, are always having to engage in combat, right? Someone is always combating the Ukrainian forces. But in a rout, everyone has withdrawn, so no one is combating the enemy forces. It allows the enemy to advance faster. It allows them to move more dynamically, and crucially, it allows them to consolidate their combat power as they advance. So it makes withdrawing, or rather being routed, is way worse, right? Because the enemy stays organized, your troops are disorganized, and the enemy can engage your forces at will. So when he goes and says, hey, they've been routed, they haven't withdrawn, that's what he's describing.
Ukraine this week.
Okay, we're gonna have to censor this clip here, but you can pick up the audio because it's from the Ukrainian armed forces.
Released what it said was footage of its forces fighting near Bakhmut. It shows soldiers exiting an armored vehicle, taking cover behind mounds of earth, and firing their weapons. Kyiv said advances around the city were not part of a planned spring counteroffensive.
Okay, so this is interesting to me that they say it's not part of the spring counteroffensive. But guys, this is not how military operations work. These are part of shaping operations, which is the military term for preparing the battlefield and preparing your enemy for the main push. What I think we can agree, this is not the main push, but I would describe this as a sort of phase one of the counteroffensive. This is pinning Russian forces in place. This is fighting potentially a battle of annihilation against some of the best Russian forces, and it's creating conditions for a larger offensive effort elsewhere. But please also remember that there is a level of deception that is important to maintain in a military operation like this, and I think that's also what Ukrainian forces are doing. They are going to try to confuse Russian forces, both at the time, the place, the size, the intention of the counteroffensive and any offensive efforts. So literally, if your goal was to confuse Russian forces, you would say that there is no counteroffensive happening, even as the counteroffensive was underway. So I just want to point that out there as a potential reality.
Which it says has yet to begin. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the city of St. Petersburg debuted what it said was a new anti-drone police unit. Footage from Russia's Interior Ministry shows heavily armed officers on rooftops above the city's Palace Square.
So this is interesting for a couple reasons. First, of course, it's very embarrassing for Russia to have a drone strike occur, though I maintain that was probably a false flag operation. The more important part is that this is, I think, part of a Russian propaganda attempt to make its citizens feel as though they are personally under attack. It's sort of like, imagine during the Vietnam War if major American cities were bombed by North Vietnamese saboteurs, right? More Americans would feel as though the war was a personal battle, as opposed to a fight taking place in a distant country for unclear reasons. That's probably the feeling that a lot of Russians have right now about Ukraine. It's a war in a distant place. It's a war with unclear objectives, with unclear reasons. But if they believed that Ukrainians were an imminent threat to themselves and their homes and their livelihoods, the Kremlin's belief is that more Russians will support it. So by seeing these drones, it's sort of like seeing military or heavily armed police in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. It was a physical reminder of the threat or perceived threat facing Russian citizens.
The new unit comes after Moscow claimed a Ukrainian drone last week detonated above the Kremlin.
I can't show that
Russia
footage
said
either.
Was an attempt.
YouTube cracks down pretty hard, honestly.
to assassinate President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine denied attacking Moscow.
Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. Thank you guys so much, as always, for joining me. Thanks to today's sponsor. And until next time, I'll see you guys in the next one.